In the Field updates on Market Journal are supported by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Let's head back into the field for UNL's South Central Ag Lab, where we were at last week covering that annual field day. While we were there, we had the chance to speak with Nebraska Extension Entomologist Bob Wright to discuss what pests might be a concern out in the fields for producers this time of year. On this week's In the Field update, we're out at a field day catching up with Nebraska Extension Entomologist Bob Wright. Bob, great to see you.
Yeah, good.
One of the things you're doing at field days and casual conversations, I suppose, with producers is reintroducing a topic that may be something that some producers' grandfathers dealt with. What is that?
That's the European corn borer, and historically it's been one of the most important corn insects, probably even more than corn rootworms in the past, partly because it's relatively hard to control with insecticides. And people who grew corn in the 80s and 90s can remember years where we had high corn borer populations and we had a lot of stalk breakage and ear dropping late in the season due to the corn borers tunneling in the stalks and ear shanks. And the first BT corns were introduced in 1996, and they were highly effective against corn borers. And they were rapidly adopted because people could see the relative advantage compared to using insecticides. And we noticed that our corn borer population dropped pretty soon after BT corn started being introduced. And entomologists across the Midwest shared data, and we could document statistically that as the BT corn acre in a state went up, the corn borer populations in our blacklight traps went down. And so they've been down pretty much in a lot of areas. But the last 4 or 5 years, we've been seeing more corn borers in some areas, particularly if people are growing popcorn or food grade corn or corn that BT corn maybe just doesn't have above ground traits. And so we're seeing some pockets where we're seeing economic populations of corn borers in those crops that don't have BT in them. And so we want to reintroduce some of the information we used to talk about a lot in terms of how to identify, how to scout for corn borers, what's the best timing of controls, those types of issues, what biological controls are active, those type of issues.
For our non-production ag audience today, you bring up BT corn, introduced in the late 1990s. Explain exactly what you mean by that.
Okay, BT is an abbreviation for Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a naturally occurring bacteria, and this type of bacteria produces some proteins that are toxic to insects. They're very specific to insects. They're a lot safer than our traditional insecticides, which are broad spectrum. And the protein has been introduced or engineered to be produced in corn and now some other crops. And different strains have different activity against different insects. There's one strain that's active against corn borers. More recently, we had a strain that's active against rootworms. That's also in a lot of our corn as well. We've had more trouble with rootworms developing resistance to the BTs. Corn borers have not developed resistance to the BTs in Nebraska, possibly because they feed on a lot of other crops that don't have BT. They can be in sorghum, they can be in potatoes, a lot of vegetable crops, a lot of garden crops, and wild hosts as well. So anyway, we are starting to see them showing up more in some areas, particularly if you grow in an isolated area, popcorn or food grade corn over years, they probably will build up, and it's something we're getting more questions about, so we wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, appreciate you giving us that overview on that. Real quick, I guess, what other challenges might a grower that's growing popcorn or some of those other specialty corn varieties you mentioned, what other challenges might they face?
Well, I guess the main thing is just being aware of what insects are possible problems. Mm-hmm. Basically, they're the same as field corn. I guess one issue is those are higher value crops, so you may need to protect them more than you would field corn, because losing a bushel of white food grade corn is worth more than regular yellow corn, and so you need to be more careful about looking for insects. The other issue is that some of these ear feeding insects can increase the likelihood of ear molds, and that's obviously important for food grade corn, something to be concerned about.